What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about the Tyranid faction focus for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. The article is up. We get a sneak peek at some of the mechanics for the Tyranid faction going into the new edition of the game, and I could not be more excited. Unfortunately for me, they don't look very good. That's not great. Warhammer community has committed to doing faction focus articles every week, so I'm going to be covering as many of them as I can, so stay tuned to the channel, do all the YouTube stuff, the likes and the subscribes and the little notification doohickey so that you can get notifications when I upload these videos. Otherwise, we'll talk about some freaking Tyranids. Now, before we dive into the article itself, there are a couple crucial mechanics that we talk about that have been spoiled previously from 10th edition that are going to be important for understanding the context of the Tyranid rules that we're going to be discussing in this video. The first one is a core rule, that being Battle Shock. Battle Shock is the new implementation of the morale mechanic. Units no longer lose models or lose casualties to attrition or morale when they take casualties. Instead, once they're below half strength, whether that's wounds on a single model unit or individual models in a unit for a multi-model unit, they have to take a Battle Shock test during the command phase. If it's failed, they get the Battle Shocked status effect, which converts their objective control to 0, requires them to take a desperate escape test for models falling back. This may be similar to the penalties imposed for disembarking a destroyed transport or using the desperate breakout stratagem in 9th edition 40k, where you have a 1 in 6 chance of losing a model to that. And it's in controlling player cannot use stratagems to affect that unit. Now, the Tyranid Codex is going to be using this Battle Shock mechanic quite a bit, at least according to this article. And Tyranids are now going to be one of the premier morale manipulation factions in 40k. Now, the other one is the Tyranid Invasion Fleet Detachment ability. The Tyranid detachment that's going to be available for Tyranid armies to use when the index becomes released, and this gives them the hyper adaptations rule. The hyper adaptations allows the Tyranid player to select a benefit at the start of the first battle round, so when the game begins, after setup, after looking at their opponent's list, they can adapt their army to be slightly better against whatever variety of list their opponent has taken against them. That is either represented by Swarming Instinct, which gives you sustained hits against infantry or swarm units, Hyper Aggression, which gives you lethal hits against monsters or vehicles, and Hive Predators, which gives you precision against characters. And as a little bit of a reminder, sustained hits gives you additional hits on critical hits, those being hit rolls of 6. Lethal hits automatically convert your critical hits into wounds without having to roll a wound roll. And precision, we don't know what it does yet, but it's likely that you will be able to select the models taking wounds when you attack a unit with a weapon that has a precision characteristic. Other heavy weapon models out of a unit very easily. So with that, we can talk about this Tyranid preview article. Just keep in mind that all of those mechanics we just talked about are also going to be in play when we discuss what's going on with this faction. The first army ability that the army has is Synapse. This is making a return as a morale buff as it has in the past. Previously, Synapse has been an immunity to morale. Now it's just becoming a benefit to your Battle Shock tests while you're within 6 inches of a Synapse creature. And importantly, there is a little bit of confusion with the datasheets. Every model in the Tyranid army has the Synapse ability. The Synapse ability itself doesn't do anything unless you're within 6 inches of a unit that has the Synapse keyword. So the ability doesn't grant the Fearless Bubble, it just gets you the benefit from Synapse models' Fearless Bubbles. It's a little bit confusing having an ability and a keyword with the same rule, but it makes sense, I swear. While you're within 6 inches of one of those Synapse models, you're going to roll 3d6 on your Battle Shock tests instead of 2d6. With Battle Shock being as important as it is for some factions and especially some units, as we've seen, things like the Screamer Killer Carnifex and Infernus squads have effects that force Battle Shock tests. Making them entirely immune to Battle Shock would be pretty transformative and probably pretty broken in a lot of situations. The Tyranid mirror match would be garbage because you would try to force Battle Shocks on each other and it would have no effect. Instead, it makes you significantly better at rolling Battle Shock tests, and for the most part, Tyranids are likely going to be largely immune to Battle Shock effects, but not entirely immune, so there is a chance that those things like those Inferno squads could potentially convert on them. Now, the other army role is also going to be tied to a lot of the Synapse units in the army, and is tied to a second ability called Shadow in the Warp. In past editions, Shadow in the Warp has been a Psychic Test manipulation effect, but now that Psychic Tests are gone, it has to do something different. And instead, it is the Tyranid army defining rule. What it does is give you a once per game effect, and importantly, this is regardless of the number of Shadow in the Warp units you have on the table. So even if you have 4 or 5 units with the Shadow in the Warp ability, the ability only checks if you have 1 or more. As soon as you use the ability once, it uses basically every use of every model with the Shadow in the Warp ability on the table. When you use that ability in either your command phase or your opponent's command phase, it forces every enemy unit on the battlefield to take a Battle Shock test. The timing is very important because being able to trigger it in your opponent's command phase is huge. The reason for that is that the Battle Shocked status effect lasts until your opponent's next command phase, meaning that forcing Battle Shock tests in your opponent's command phase will Battle Shock that unit not only for the remainder of that command phase, forcing them to be objective control 0 when they get to their primary objective scoring step of their turn, but also they will not be able to hold contest objectives or use stratagems on any of those units that fail through their turn and your turn, meaning that both offensive and subsequently defensive stratagems are turned off entirely. Now, the big downside of this ability, it is totally random. There is no control that you have over whether or not your opponent's units are going to be failing those Battle Shock tests. So if there are units that are key to holding objectives down, there is nothing as far as we can see so far that you can do to incentivize them to fail that Battle Shock test. Now, there's likely going to be some ways to modify Battle Shock tests within the Tyranid faction as a whole, but for whatever reason, none of them have been previewed in this article. So the assumption right now is that nothing interacts with this. It's likely that things will, but we just literally don't know. Right now, if you go against a lot of other armies, they have probably a 30% chance to fail their Battle Shock tests, which means 1/3 of their army will become Battle Shocked once you use the Shadow in the Warp. The downside of this ability is that you don't have control over which models do, which means it's very inconsistent and it's difficult to build a game plan around. Now, the effect of the ability is going to be incredibly strong. The article indicates that when your objective control becomes 0, you no longer control objectives, which was an open question we've had in the past about the mechanics in the new edition, which is huge. So if your opponent has some low leadership backline objective holders, you can force them to fail and absolutely tank their primary objective score for a round. The fact that it's only going to affect most likely a small proportion of your opponent's army and you don't have control over which proportion that is makes it highly inconsistent in my opinion. So with that, those are the faction abilities for Tyranids. Let's move on to some data sheets. The first one we have, and this one I'm honestly super psyched about, is the Gene Stealers. Now, Gene Stealers have gotten a pretty transformative change in this new edition. In 9th edition, they were forward deployers. They were mostly used as utility units, and occasionally they could do a little bit of damage, but 10th edition is looking to make them a lot more lethal and a little bit tankier. While they retain their 8-inch movement, 4 toughness, and 5+ save, as well as a 5+ invulnerable, unfortunately losing their 4+ invulnerable save in melee, and their relatively low objective control value of 1, they do get, importantly, a second wound. Small arms fire goes from rinsing this unit down and removing them immediately to them being much more resilient against it. With the larger emphasis on 0 AP weapons in the new edition, with most small arms fire becoming AP 0 as well, the ability of Gene Stealers to benefit from light cover, going from a 5+ save to a 4+, is also going to be a little bit more impactful and make these guys even more resilient against that style of shooting. While multi-damage weapons will kill them, they're most likely going to be relatively light, probably relatively inexpensive infantry, and having your opponent fire multi-damage high-impact weapons at Gene Stealers is just good for you. Now, on top of that, they've also gotten a little bit of a glow-up in melee as well, going from a 3+ weapon skill to a 2+, although usually they sourced a 2+ weapon skill or rerolls in the previous version. Now you don't have to do that. They have that baked in. While the AP of their talons did get reduced a little bit from 3 down to 2, and unfortunately they don't have any mechanics like devastating wounds that we would have expected to see in the past, they do have the Vanguard Predator ability. This gives them permanent reroll 1s to wound. In addition, if they attack a target on an objective marker, they can reroll the entire wound roll. This makes Gene Stealers absolutely lethal at darting in and disrupting your opponent's control of objectives by killing their backline objective holders or even medium infantry like intercessors. They've lost their infiltrate ability, but have instead gained the Scout 8-inch ability. My hope is that infiltrate abilities, forward deploys, and concealed position deployment, where units would start 9 inches out of the opponent's deployment zone, have been replaced by the scout mechanic. The infiltrate ability is a little bit one-sided. The player who's deploying first and or going first gets huge benefits if they're able to deploy their infiltrators and then activate with them before their opponent does. It really skews the go first benefit that at least Arcs of Omen 40k has had so far. The scout ability, while it's still similarly strong, is not nearly the same level, and the threat range you get out of your deployment zone isn't quite as bad. However, it still gives you the opportunity to screen, to take forward objectives, and to fight over the midboard on the first turn, which I think is exactly where Genestealers want to go. Assuming that we see good, solid line of sight blocking terrain in the new edition, I can see big bricks of Genestealers using that 8-inch scout move to take advantage of forward terrain, be incredibly difficult to kill from any light, fast, small arms fire that can see them because of that second wound, and then bust out of those defensive positions and just wreak havoc on your opponent's objectives on turn 2 onward. A little bit less of an alpha strike unit, but much more dangerous. Super psyched about Genestealers. This profile is actually sweet. A little bit more of a side grade, however, is the next datasheet that's been spoiled. My main man himself, the Swarmlord. The Swarmlord's datasheet is basically unrecognizable from the 9th edition or even 8th edition versions of this monster. He's been reworked basically from the ground up, going up a couple points of toughness up to toughness 10, which to be fair is on the higher side of the toughness bracket. He retains his 2+ save and 4+ invulnerable save, but has lost 3 wounds as well as his blade parry ability. He has no defensive abilities whatsoever besides that baked-in invulnerable save. He has a relatively light objective control value of 3 and a couple core abilities, including Deadly Demise D3, meaning he explodes for D3 mortal wounds, and the Leader ability. Now, the Leader ability, it will be broken down on the flip side of the Swarmlord's card. It tells you what units he can join as his retinue. I imagine being a Hive Tyrant that he will be able to join Tyrant Guard units, and I think that's going to be the primary use case of Tyrant Guard units, where instead of being a bodyguard that projects an aura that protects Hive Tyrants now join their unit like they would a regular unit. I'm crossing my fingers that Hive Tyrants and Swarmlord could join units that are not just Tyrant Guard, but that in the past has not been the case, and I don't think that's going to happen. While I would like to see Swarmlord in bricks of Tyranid Warriors or something like that, I think that it may be baked into his design that he's meant to come with a couple Tyrant Guard to make him more difficult to kill. With that relatively light defensive profile, I would assume that that is the intention, but I hope he's not so expensive as to make him and his Tyrant Guard buddies exorbitantly costly. He has the Shadow Wind the Warp ability, as we said before, so he unlocks the use of that once per game Battle Shock Pulse, and has a bunch of army support abilities specifically around command point efficiency. He himself gains you an additional CP at the start of your command phase. He also has the Malign Presence ability, and anyone who remembers the heady days of A Plan Generations in the Making and Agents of Vect from the old Drukhari Codex will recognize this ability. Kairos Fateweaver also has it currently, I think, as well. Once per battle, after your opponent uses a stratagem, if Swarmlord is your Warlord, so it's essentially a Warlord trait for him, you can increase the cost of the stratagem by 1 CP for your opponent only. Now, importantly, there are no stratagems that are disallowed by this ability, and while we don't have confirmation that the command reroll stratagem still exists in 10th edition, it's likely that it does, and it is targetable by this, meaning you can potentially make all of your opponent's CP rerolls or defensive stratagems like Transhuman Physiology more expensive for the entire game. Absolutely ludicrous. On top of that, he also has Domination of the Hive Mind, which increases his synapse range from 6 inches up to 9. Now, we've also seen changes in units like the Space Marine Librarian to psychic powers, where they've become psychic keyworded weapons instead of a power that you use in the psychic phase. And that is the case for Swarmlord as well, who has lost his 2 casts and 2 denies that he had in previous editions for a single synaptic pulse, an 18-inch range torrent weapon, meaning it automatically hits for D6 plus 3 strength 5 AP 1/2 damage attacks. That's a pretty solid profile, and especially given the fact that it automatically hits, it does have a pretty reasonable damage output, but wounding most vehicles on 6s, the use case of this weapon is going to be relatively light. With that low AP value as well, firing at infantry and cover, for example, means it's going to bounce most of the time. So I would rather have had a regular smite than this. I think more often than not, this is going to bounce or maybe deal a maximum of 2 damage, which is what you would expect from smite. He's also seen a little bit of a debuff in melee. His Bone Saber is being reduced down to 8 attacks from 9 and down to AP2 instead of AP4, which is a pretty significant downgrade. They have picked up the Twin Linked ability, however, giving him rerolls to wound in melee. And that's especially important given that Strength 9 is a significant downgrade from where it was in 9th edition. Strength 9 is now the equivalent of basically Strength 7 based on where other vehicles are. So he's going to be wounding most vehicles on 4s or 5s. That full reroll gets him around it a little bit. You could get him access to full rerolls in the 9th edition codex using Voracious Appetite, but now obviously it saves him a CP. That AP2 is what kills him, I think. Generally speaking, the Strength 9 Twin-Linked profile is very good. That's going to get you, 5 or 6 wounds against most targets most of the time. But the issue is that his AP value is so low, a lot of targets will be able to save out of it pretty easily. And he's not really going to be able to do much damage to kill most things in the game. Largely, I think it's a side grade for Swarmlord. The reduction in his defensive characteristics is pretty impactful, and his offensive output is a little laughable in the new version. But obviously, he does have that CP manipulation in the context of players having less access to command points. Right now, it looks like you'll start with 0 command points and get 1 during each command phase, so you'll basically be playing with 10 over the course of a game. But if we see a lot of abilities like Gilliman's, where you get up to 2 free stratagems per battle round, and even Swarmlord's effect to get additional command points, then suddenly those command points don't look quite as valuable as they did. However, if those abilities are few and far between, then getting an additional 5 command points over your opponent and nuking one of their best stratagems is going to be enormously transformative. Not really sure what to think about the Swarmlord so far. I don't think I like him, but I don't know. If he remains around the same points cost that he does currently, he's going to be a tough sell for a lot of people. But if he gets a significant points cut, he might actually be pretty sweet. Now, speaking of stratagems, we also got a stratagem spoiled in this article. The Endless Swarm stratagem is making a return in the Invasion Fleet detachment. Previously, Endless Swarm allowed an Endless Multitude unit like Termagants, Hormagants, Gargoyles, and the article confirms that the new Neuragant unit also has the Endless Swarm keyword to return D3+3 destroyed models. However, in 10th edition, it now has a hugely impactful second clause. If you, instead of targeting a single Endless Multitude unit, target 2 Endless Multitude units that are within synapse range of your army, that means 6 inches of a synapse creature or 9 inches of Swarmlord, you can return D3+3 to both of them, up to a potential 12 models. Now, obviously, Endless Swarm is already a pretty decent stratagem. While I'm a little bit worried about the usefulness of Horde units in the new edition, some of the rumors surrounding melee and charges make Horde units seem pretty unplayable, and the ability of armies like Space Marines to remove large units from the table basically immediately using Oaths of Moment is a little disconcerting. But on the flip side, Endless Swarm has always been useful for holding objectives, given that you're able to return models to your units before the scoring section of your command phase checks. So for example, if you're being out objective controlled on an objective, you can be putting several 4 to 6 OC2 Termagants back on that objective pretty quickly. So already it's pretty playable, but that second effective being more effective if you're within synaptic range is super cool. And if we see more stratagems have that additional super-powered, supercharged effect, if you target them within synapse range, I think that Tyranid stratagems are going to be really interesting. And Tyranids are going to be incentivized to play in a more cohesive unit where a lot of their units remain within 6 inches of each other in order to benefit from the more powerful effects of their stratagems, which is not only super fluffy, but also creates a lot of interesting gameplay on the table. Now, last and certainly also least, we have the spoiling of the Rupture Cannon profile for the Tyran effect. Now, I was pretty excited to see a spoiler for the Rupture Cannon, given the enormous glow-up that the Heavy Laser Destroyer, a similar weapon on the Repulsor Executioner, got, going from D3+3 damage to D6+4, the same profile that the Rupture Cannon already had. Instead, the Port Tyran effects has actually been significantly debuffed, going from 3 attacks down to 2, while it has increased in strength from 14 up to 18. What we have to remember is that the toughness of targets are also going to be increasing. increasing, meaning that it continues to wound things like rhinos on 2s and other heavily armored vehicles on 3s, which is already where it was in 9th edition. Its AP value remains the same at AP 4, however, it's been debuffed down to 2d6 damage instead of d6 plus 4. The d6 plus 4 averages a little bit higher than 2d6, the average of a single d6 being 3.5, meaning that you are averaging 7.5 damage with the previous version. However, the 2d6 is, as idiosyncratic as it sounds, a little bit more consistently getting 7 damage, because moving from a 2d6 damage weapon to a d6 with a flat bonus, you're actually now on a bell curve with multiple dice, and 7 is the most common result of that. While there's a higher potential damage, you have a little bit more consistent sort of median damage, but obviously the downside coming with the fact that you can snake eyes the damage on this gun. And with only 2 attacks, the variance is going to be absolutely ludicrous. While it does have the new heavy weapon attribute, so it's able to stand still and shoot, I think that is largely going to be a little bit tough, given that it's then going to be a magnet for anti-tank fire if it wants to stand in the open for a turn, which is going to be a little bit of a difficult sell. But given the fact that this thing has lost an entire attack, it does significantly less damage against basically any target than it did previously, even with that +1 to hit. Honestly, a little bit confused as to why they showed this one. It's a good way to make people less excited about Tyrannofexes. Obviously, with the change in defensive characteristics, the position of the Rupture Cannon in the overall arsenal of Tyranids has changed quite a bit. It's gone to basically being a light vehicle killer, where it's very likely to kill a rhino or equivalent chassis on a single shot, but it's significantly less effective against heavily armored targets like opposing tanks. And with the high defensive stats that we're seeing out of those tanks, and not quite yet seeing similar offensive stats out of the spoiled Tyranid units, it looks like Tyranids may be back to the times where they had difficulty cracking through heavily armored vehicles. That said, they do have that gene rot might effect from the lethal hits mechanic that they get from their hyper aggression adaptation. So it may be that swarms of Hormigants or Termagants can either shoot or claw down vehicles just fine, and taking these huge anti-tank weapons is actually totally unnecessary, but we don't quite know the profiles of all of those different units and how their internal synergies work within the faction quite yet, so there's not too much to speculate on. Overall, I think this article's a little bit confused. They showed off some interesting faction mechanics and data sheets, but nothing that actually meshed those things together. Whereas the Shadow and the Warp seems like it could be randomly very powerful, I think it needs some other mechanics to synergize with it in order to be truly on the same level as an effect like Oaths of Moment from Space Marines. And right now, we just haven't been shown those. And it's a little bit weird and disconcerting that if those things exist, they wouldn't also show off at least some sort of synergy within this article. That said, there's a lot of data sheets to see, and we're early days yet, so it may be that Tyranids actually have a lot going on under the hood that we just haven't been shown yet. It's just unfortunate that they didn't want to give us any of that, and instead gave us a 1,000-mile view that didn't really give a good holistic view of the faction. Also showing data sheets like Swarmlord and Rupture Cannons that got, like, at best a side grade, and at worst got dramatically debuffed, is a little bit disheartening as well. But anyway, let me know down in the comments section what you think. Is the sky falling for Tyranids, or is everyone dramatically overreacting? Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.